A pleasure to meet y'all at last, and welcome back to Films I'm Willing to Talk About Again. And now it's time to talk a little bit about a fourth film. Well, actually this will be like film number 6 because 3 episodes I spent talking about Finding Nemo as well as all 4 of the Shrek films. Again. But now it's about time that I talk about another film out there, which I've actually talked a bit about its sequel in the first season of Films I Should Have Talked About years ago, because, well, soon enough this year, I will be having a second season of Films I Should Have Talked About years ago, just so we can have a lot more content coming around for this year. But in any case, The Incredibles, released in late 2004, making it a pretty old film by now. I mean, it's literally old enough to be called a classic by this point. Not even 20 years ago, and it's still going incredibly strong out there. Mostly for the fact that in 2018, it got a sequel. It took 14 years to make because, as I mentioned before last year, the film took a long time to make because Pixar is a small team of creators. Well-known personnel who work very hard to make CG as it is today. And they spent way more time on the second film than they did with the first. And it's pretty apparent why that is. The Incredibles is in fact a film about the world of superheroes. But it's a bit of a different take on it. The superhero transgression that had taken place between the different realities that we've gotten to know about. The special stigma that comes up when superheroes try to do different kinds of work that most people will not allow. And as a result, Mr. Incredible, who is well known for being very strong, very fast, very agile, and also pretty smart in getting to know about enemies as a whole. The many different supervillains that have shown up left and right, including the infamous Bomb Voyage, who was in fact a French bomb expert. And not to mention, whom would eventually try to come across to Mr. Incredible, being a big fan and all that, someone known as Buddy Pines, who goes by the name Incrediboy, but eventually fails to do good by any means, and eventually ends up getting arrested and sent straight home, never to come across the path of Mr. Incredible ever again. But this would in fact become one of the worst choices that might have ever happened in Mr. Incredible's life. Bob Parr, whom in fact gets together with another superhero known as Elastigirl, whom eventually becomes known as Helen Parr. They eventually get married, find a good house, and have some children, whom are known as Violet, Dash, and Jack Jack Parr. Eventually, what gets down to the fact is that when trying to living a new reality with a bunch of children whom are also linked to superhero powers, including force fields, invisibility, high speeds, and a ton of others, thanks to Jack Jack's unbelievable array of different powers, including being able to light on fire, to become bulletproof, to turn into a super strong monster. And as I mentioned before with the sequel, we get to see way more powers that Jack Jack has ever had, making Jack Jack pretty much the biggest hero of all, even though Jack Jack's literally just a baby. I mean, it just goes to show you can never underestimate a newborn by any means. But anyways, The Incredibles gives us a bit of a good insight on how superheroes try to live normal lives whenever possible. Mr. Incredible is in fact an insurance agent who occasionally gets into some difficulty with the boss. And the boss, whom is in fact voiced by Wallace Shawn, the same guy who voices Rex from the Toy Story films, is in fact not so good against Mr. Incredible. But eventually it gets down to a point where things get heated to the point that Mr. Incredible actually gets fired after picking the boss up by the neck and then shoving the guy down a bunch of walls. Like, that's definitely a way to get fired, maybe even arrested and thrown in prison for the rest of your life. So how Mr. Incredible managed to avoid a lot of that is beyond me. But in any case, it goes down to the point where Mr. Incredible is desperately trying to find a good job out there and eventually trying to find a way to get more superhero work. Because even though it's banned, Mr. Incredible has to find a way to get the good old days back into action. Because not everybody's able to stand the new reality that comes into place. Looking at everybody who has survived the pandemic that is just coming to an end, finally, after more than 2 years of living with this stuff. But anyways, this actually does get more interesting because as time goes on, Mr. Incredible does a lot of great stuff. Tries to bond with the children, tries to have some more time spent with the family as a whole, while also trying to have some secret hero work put into place, thanks to the likes of an expert known as Edna Mode, whom is in fact voiced by Brad Bird. Yeah, the same guy who did the works for the Iron Giant, Family Guy, and The Simpsons, and also being the director pretty much of this movie, also voices Edna Mode. Although that eventually changes with the sequel for the most part. But at least this is just an amazing take on a feminine voice. Who would have thought that that would be possible? But it goes down to the point eventually where Helen comes across this secret work and eventually visits the place where Edna Mode lives at and is then given a tour of the place, pretty much, including the underground bunker, which also doubles as the showcase to where the entire family's worth of suits are in fact shown in their glory. Edna describes a lot of this stuff to Helen and explains everything that had happened. And it eventually goes down to the point where we do see a lot of key retrospectives that are put together. It turns out Bob Parr had lied about being in a job and was in fact doing a lot of superhero work behind everybody's back. And for all the time that had been spent after getting fired from the insurance job, it's pretty much going to show that Mr. Incredible could not be trusted, and the entire family was just living on rails, pretty much. Helen eventually gets the idea to borrow a government aircraft and inadvertently take the children with. It's only because they actually snuck on board. All except for Jack Jack, whom is in fact under the care of a babysitter, whom was in fact taken under the wing by Violet. Thankfully, at least. It's worthy to note by this point that a short film was actually made based on all the things that had happened from the point that Jack Jack and this babysitter had made the contact with Helen on the plane, all the way to the very point where at the end of the movie, the Incredible is going to find Jack Jack, who was in fact being kidnapped by the new antagonist that they now have to face together. But the thing is that, well, this antagonist is in fact the same guy who once tried to work with Mr. Incredible, the Incrediboy, Bunny Pines, who was now under a new alias, Syndrome. This is in fact where things really come together. Being one of the greatest antagonists I might have seen in a superhero film, and this of course is not going to include Thanos. This is not going to include the likes of the Guardians of the Galaxy ones, or the Iron Man ones, or the Thor ones, or any kind of ones from the MCU. It's an overrated series that has no ending, it seems. I'm specifically talking about Syndrome, one of the greatest and the best that we ever could have seen as a supervillain role. And so, just bear with me here. Syndrome is just unbelievably amazing. No doubt about that. But the real thing here that I'm explaining to you is the fact that Syndrome is unlike many others that we've seen. This is one of those cases where somebody gets turned down by their common idol, the person whom they love the most. And so, the superhero turns down someone's idea, and eventually they get the idea to become their greatest threat in life. Sworn enemy, villain, criminal, any kind of thing at all would work. But the thing is that Syndrome's backstory was crazy by all means. And so, Buddy Pines got the idea to turn from a superhero into a super villain, One who in fact eventually got the money to be able to afford an entire army's worth of people to go up against the Incredibles. This includes a bunch of soldiers and guards, a bunch of robots, some rockets and jets, all thanks to somebody known by the name of Mirage. And so, their combined efforts to try and eliminate the Incredibles family as a whole, including the part where they actually launched missiles at the plane that Helen was in, along with Violet and Dash. It got to the point where they needed to come together and fight this new threat. And so the Incredibles in the jungle took on pretty much whatever the army threw at them. And as such, when Syndrome finally showed up and began to use these specialized gloves that are capable of putting people in immobilization fields of some sorts, ways that where they're unable to move, except for their eyeballs, which occasionally jerk around. So, yeah, the thing is that this is an enemy that is not like many others we've seen before. And so, Syndrome is one of a kind, if you will. Eventually, it's revealed to the Incredibles that Syndrome plans to strike the city with another robot, similar to one that Mr. Incredible had fought earlier in the film. And so, this new robot would in fact be able to adapt even greater than the other one could. One that would be able to learn a lot of people's weaknesses and a lot of ways that would potentially put it out for good and try to prevent them to the best of its ability. And so when this robot finally lands in the city and the Incredibles eventually escape from Syndrome's compound and find a way off the island that they're on thanks to a rocket that Mirage was able to provide to them, they eventually make their way back to the city. They fight the robot with the help of another hero known as Frozone, whom is in fact a good friend of Mr. Incredible. They were actually able to defeat the robot itself. They were able to pinpoint weaknesses of all sorts and eventually take it out for good. Syndrome realizes that the Incredibles had actually defeated this giant droid and then tries to think of a backup plan. And that's pretty much where the short film about Jack-Jack pretty much comes to an end. When Syndrome actually shows up to the Incredibles' house, the babysitter answers and pretty much just goes down from there. Syndrome is inside their house. And once the Incredibles make their way back to them, the family realizes that Syndrome is now threatening their own child's life. Jack-Jack is in fact taken away and eventually fights back, which is just crazy. It really goes to show that a baby can be this powerful, especially as a super, by all means. Eventually it goes down to the point where, because of some specific tip that Edna Mode mentioned when it comes to having a cape on your outfit, that was eventually the biggest weakness that Syndrome had. And so, that is actually where Syndrome dies. Syndrome gets caught in a turbine that sucks the cape inside, eventually jamming it and causing it to explode. The aircraft itself is pretty much destroyed, and the whole thing comes back down to Earth. And thankfully, Violet was able to shield everybody from getting blown up by this debris. So, we also can't forget about the young child on a bicycle, or a tricycle, I should say. So, yeah. Eventually, this sets way for a sequel, as at the very end of the film, it showcases a potential new main antagonist called the Underminer. But believe it or not, they actually managed to make something that would have been as close to a sequel to The Incredibles as possible, with a PlayStation 2 game in 2005 called The Incredibles Rise of the Underminer, which I played a lot before on PlayStation 2 as well as Nintendo DS. Not quite as good as the other one, but still, as a portable console, it does okay, I'd say. We certainly cannot forget about what The Incredibles 2 did, though, in 2018. It pretty much picked up where the first one left off, but had no connotation towards what Rise of the Underminer showed us. And so, the least they could have done was at least give us a bit of a recreation of the scenes from Rise of the Underminer, and it eventually would have given us a good excuse to say, they did it right. But no, not in the world of Pixar, they did not. And so, that just doesn't really matter. I don't even know why I have to mention this kind of stuff. But still, having some good consistency while trying to not ignore any of the things that exist would have been pretty helpful here. But overall, The Incredibles from 2004, the same year that we've gotten to know about tons of other great movies, sure did give us something different to look forward to. And that really leads us to wonder though, since The Incredibles 2 became a pretty good success as well, spawning tons of different things out there. Will there ever be an Incredibles 3? Maybe. I mentioned before it could take a long time for them to make this as well, just the same as they did so with the second film. 14 years it spanned between both the first and second film, and so the third film might take a similar amount of time, if not longer or even shorter, depending on what Pixar is wanting to do. And so, with that in mind, that just pretty much concludes another big section of films I'm willing to talk about again. But don't worry, because I will be here with some more material very soon. And if you want to see more, go down to my channel, then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.